Alright, welcome back. In this lecture, we will be covering the blueprint editor, as well as explaining what are blueprints and how we're going to utilize them throughout this course to develop our survival game. So blueprints are essentially nodes that you connect together, and it's a very visual way that you can script or program gameplay logic. So you don't have to type a single line of code, and what you can do instead is just connect nodes together using little wires, and it's a really easy programming system that allows you to very quickly create gameplay. So to give you a really good example of how blueprints work, so in this first person template map, if we hit play here, you see that we have our character, we have like our character arms, and if we run up to this weapon, you can see that when we get near it, we automatically equip this weapon. So this is all made in Blueprint. And then I can go ahead and shoot this cube. You can see a ball spawns out of the weapon, and whenever we shoot one of these cubes, it goes flying in the air and all that stuff. So all of that is implemented through Blueprint. And how we can look at all the blueprints is, if you go into Content Drawer, what I'm going to do is dock this in Layout. In our content here, we have our first person. Inside there we have a folder for blueprints. So in here we have pretty much everything that you just saw in the level when we clicked play. We have things like our first person character, so our character that has the arms. We have that little yellow ball that we were shooting out of the weapon. Then we have the actual weapon itself. So these are all blueprints. Blueprints contain these little nodes inside of them that program and allow us to program all the logic that you just saw. So let's go ahead and open up our first person character blueprint. So double click to open this up. And I'm going to take this window and drag and dock it right here at the top. And so if this is your very first time opening up a blueprint, you don't have to worry. It might be a little overwhelming at first, not knowing exactly what everything is, but I'm going to explain this entire editor so that you're not lost. But basically, we'll start off here with our main viewport, or in this case it is called the event graph. So if I scroll in and out here, you can see that I can use my mouse button to scroll in and out. So just the scroll wheel on your mouse. And then your right mouse button allows you to pan around. Okay? Now what you're going to notice inside of here is we can see a bunch of little nodes. You can see some text, some comments here. And basically this is all that Blueprint consists of. So for example, this jump, so our character can jump, and basically all that the Blueprint jump action consists of is this button. So if you press the space bar on your keyboard, when it's clicked pressed, the character will jump. When you let go of the space bar, it will stop jumping. That's quite literally all that Blueprint is. You take one node and you connect it to another. So this form of visual scripting is really a beginner-friendly way of programming, and because of it, you can really quickly piece nodes together and make an entire game. Now, we also have these other tabs over here. So let's go ahead and start off on the very left. So we have the viewport, and what you'll notice here right off the bat is that we have our character arms. So if you remember when we hit play, we could see our character arms right about here. And that's because we have things like a camera in here, and this is basically where our player sees our character. Okay, so really all this blueprint consists of is this camera, this character's arms, and this little collision. And so all of the little bits that you put together are held inside of this little viewport. Now let's talk about the Components tab. So a component is literally anything that you can add inside of your blueprint. So for example, this character blueprint, all it is made up of is these different components. So we have our first person mesh, which is our character arms. That is basically a skeletal mesh component. We have our first person camera, and that is just a camera component. Then we have our capsule component, which is basically our collision. So all that a blueprint consists of are some components as well as some blueprint nodes. Now every time you select one of these different components, notice in the details panel that our details panel changes depending on which component we have selected. So the details panel inside of this blueprint editor, all it shows is various different details depending on whichever component you have selected in your blueprint. So for example, if I select my character, my first person mesh, you're going to see we have, the details such as the location, rotation, and scale. And we also have this little movement gizmo. So if you take this movement gizmo, you can move the character's arms around. We can Control Z to undo that. We can also, click R on our keyboard and scale it up or down. And you can see that the details are changing depending on however we modify our components. Now another thing you can change in here are, things like the mesh, the materials, all of your basic details that you would normally have whenever you select any sort of object inside of Unreal Engine. Now one thing in the viewport that I forgot to discuss is that you have your main viewport controls just like you normally would inside of your main viewport in the editor. So for example, you could switch from rotation, scaling, or moving so that you can move not only components around, you can also scale things up, and you can also change your grid snapping by disabling or enabling. And if you need to, you can change your camera speed. That way you don't have a super fast camera speed. Okay. You also have some perspectives. So if you need to see the right view of your character or go back into perspective mode, you have all those different settings. Okay, so we covered the components tab. We've covered the viewport, the event graph, and then the details. Let's go ahead and move down over here to this bottom part. So compiler results, I'll kind of explain this later on in this lecture, but basically if you ever have some sort of error, it will let you know what the error is and where you can find it. Find results is just as the name suggests. So if you need to search something, for example, a jump, it's going to show all of the nodes that are named jump. Okay, so I can click on it and it will zoom in on that node. So that's compiler results and find results. The next window that we have is the My Blueprint. So the My Blueprint is where you can access the graphs. So for example, our event graph. So if for whatever reason you accidentally close the event graph, you can double click it to get it back right there. We have the construction script, which we will talk about in a second. And we have macros and variables, which we will also discuss later on in this lecture. Now up here at the very top on this toolbar, you're going to see things like the compile button. Basically, if you make any sort of changes here on your blueprint graph, or in your viewport, if you scale your model or make any changes in here, you're going to want to hit this compile. And what the compile does is it compiles your code to see if there's any sort of errors. And if there is any sort of errors, it will let you know down here in the compiler results. The next is the save. So every time you make any changes, you want to make sure you obviously save. And that will apply the changes in your level. That way you can test it out. The next is this browse button, and you're going to see this magnifying glass folder icon a lot inside of Unreal Engine. And all that does is if you click on it, it will show you inside your content browser where exactly this blueprint is located. So this is a really useful tool, and you'll see it a lot on the details panel. You'll see this icon a lot, and basically all that is find in the content browser wherever that asset is located at. Next thing we have differences. So this is if you want to compare your blueprint against any sort of differences. I don't necessarily use that much. We have the find, which pulls up the find results. So if you need to search for any specific node. Hide unrelated. I don't really use this particular node. Under the class settings, this pulls up a whole nother separate details window. So you'll notice if we go into the viewport and select on the character arms or the camera, if we click on the class settings, it'll pull up a whole details panel here that has various settings relating to this character blueprint. So we will use this a lot throughout our course, and we will talk a lot about this later on in some future lectures. But for now, we can gloss over it. Class defaults, again, we're going to be using this in some future lectures, but this has various default values that we can change that will affect how our character will move or run and all that sort of stuff. Simulate basically simulates everything inside your blueprint. So what that does is basically when you hit play, it will simulate all of the events so that you can see what's going on. Now this play button is the same as this other play button. So if you hit play here, it's sort of like a quick way that you can play test your game. So this will open a new editor window or new play editor window where you can move around and test out your character. Now this no debug option selected, this is another advanced feature that we will discuss in some future lectures in this course. But for now, that is all of the windows and basics of the blueprint editor. Another thing that I want to mention is the construction script. So if we open up the construction script here, if you double click to open this up, so again, if you for whatever reason you close it, you can go into the functions here and open up the construction script. Basically the construction script, any blueprint nodes that you put inside of here will happen before the game has started. So usually this will happen right before the game starts. Compared to the event graph, everything on the event graph, all the blueprint nodes in here are executed either when the game starts or when the game is currently being played. Okay? So things like the jump, all that stuff can only happen or can only be executed when the game is actually being played. So let's go ahead and add our very first blueprint node. So to add a node on your graph here, all you have to do is when you right click on the graph, you're going to see this menu pop up. And this is how you add various different nodes to your graph. So how you added things like this jump and stop jumping. Basically these are nodes that are already built in to this project and to the Unreal Engine. And all you have to do to find these nodes is to right click anywhere in your graph and to search for jump. But what we want to do is we just want to do something super simple. All we want to do is when the game starts, we want to print something like hello world. So what we want to do is right click and search for the event begin play. And so this event begin play, if we go ahead and click on it, it will add the node to our graph. Now one thing that you'll notice is if you left click and drag, that will allow you to select nodes, and then you can left click and drag the node around to move it around on your graph. So you can also select multiple nodes and move them around just by left clicking and dragging them like so. So we have our event begin play. The event begin play executes at the start of the game. So to add a print string or a print message that will say something like hello world, what we can also do is right click in our blueprint and search for a print string. So we have this print string node. So if we click on that, we have this little print string. All this node does is it prints on our screen a little message. And for the message, you can select inside of here for the string, and you can type in any message that you want. So we're going to type in hello world. Now all we want to do now is basically connect these two nodes so that when we hit the play button or when the event begin play is started, because we hit play, we want to print a string that says hello world. So to hook these two nodes up, we have these execution pins, and if you drag off of these execution pins, you'll notice we have these little wires that we can use to connect two nodes together. So if we drop it here on this execution pin, you can see that we've now connected these two nodes together, and we now have our very first blueprint code or blueprint logic. So we can go ahead and test this out to see if this works by first hitting this compile and save button. Then if we head over to our first person blueprint map, if we hit the play button, you're going to see in the top right or in the top left, it was very quick, so we'll hit play again. You can see the text hello world is printed to the screen. So that's all that these two nodes do, and that's literally all that blueprint is. It is basically just some nodes that are connected together to make some sort of logic or some sort of gameplay. You can also, if you wanted to change a text, you type in test text, compile and save it, and if you hit play again, you're going to see that the text is changed. So as you can see, Blueprint is actually really simple to learn, and once you get the hang of it, you can become really fast at connecting these nodes together to create whatever you want. Now, if you want to delete certain nodes, or if you want to disconnect these two nodes, the key to do that on the keyboard is to hold Alt on the keyboard and click on the execution pin. Okay, so if we connect this together, we can hold Alt and click, and that will disconnect those two nodes together. Okay. The other thing we can do is if we drag and select this node, we can hit delete on our keyboard, and it will delete that node. And we can also do Control Z to undo that. And we also have our copy and paste controls. So if we want to copy and paste this string, we can select it, Control C, Control V, and then we could hook these up together. And what we should see is these two strings being printed out twice. So if we compile and save that and hit play, you can see that we have it printed out twice on our screen. So again, very simple copy and paste, delete, and Alt to unconnect these two pins. The next thing that I want to cover are variables. So if you notice here in the Blueprint tab, we have not only functions, but also variables. And a variable is just a collection of data. So what I mean by that is we can add a variable by hitting this little plus button. So if you hit this little plus button, it'll add a new variable. Now this variable is of the type Boolean because every single variable is not only one, color coded by a color. So Booleans are red, but also the name of the variable is right next to it. So what we'll do first is to explain what a Boolean is. Let's go ahead and name this variable to is player dead ? And you're going to notice whenever I name variables, we use the basically sort of like the camel case naming convention, or every first letter of each word is capitalized. Okay, so assume you do this throughout the course. But once you press enter and name that variable, let's go ahead and explain basically what a Boolean is. So the main thing you're going to notice here in the details panel is that we have this variable that we have selected. We can see all the various details related to this variable. So for example, we can see things like the variable name. So if we wanted to change that, we could change that here as well as here. The variable type. So we click this drop down button, you're going to see that we have many other different types of variables, which I will get to here in a second. We have a description. Then we have a couple of different options. Now at the very bottom, the thing that we want to focus on is the default value. So if you remember when I said each variable is a collection of data, if we compile the blueprint by hitting the compile button, you're going to see under the default value we have this little checkbox, is the player dead? So you can see when I hover over it right now, it says false, but if I click this little checkbox, it says true. So that's literally all that a Boolean variable is. It's either a true or false statement. So if you uncheck it, is our player dead is set to false, but if we check that box, it is set to true. So we can compile and save that. Now to use this variable inside of our event graph, what we can do is we can select it and drag it onto our graph. And you're going to see we have these two options that pop up. The very first option is we can get is player dead, or we can set is player dead. Let's go ahead and first get is player dead. So what you can see now is we have our variable here, is our player dead. You can see we have this little red pin that if we drag off, we have our little blueprint menu right here. So this is our Boolean variable. What we want to do is we're going to basically check and see if this value is set to true or false, or to check and see if our player is dead or not. So if you drag off of this node, it will pull up this little menu, and what we're going to type in this little menu is a branch. So a branch, if we click on that, basically all that a branch does is it checks to see if a Boolean is true or false. And if it is true, everything that is hooked up off of the true will be executed. And if it is set to false, everything off of the false will be executed. Okay? So now what we can do is we can hook up this branch to our event begin play. So we can either do that by clicking Alt to break this link and then connecting it up like so, or we can also use a shortcut. If you hold Control on your keyboard and if you select the execution pin over here, you can move it to the branch like so. Okay, so either way would work by connecting it like so. It's the same sort of thing. So we've hooked up our branch, and now what we want to do is we're basically checking to see is our player dead, either true or false, and then we're going to hook up the true to our print string, and in our string we can type in our player is dead. Now what we want to do is select this print string and copy and paste it and hook it up also to the false. And then what we want to type in for the print string is change this to our player is not dead. Okay. So now what we're doing is when we play the game, we're going to check to see if this Boolean variable is set to true or false. Okay, which represents basically if our player is dead or not. And if it is dead, it's going to print a string that says our player is dead, but if it is not set to true, so if our player is not dead, it's going to print our player is not dead. So right now we have this set to false, so we can compile and save this. And what we should see is our player is not dead. So if we go over to our map, hit play, you can see our player is not dead. It's just printed on the screen. But if we go ahead and select our variable, or select it here, in the default value, if we change this to true to represent our player is dead, we compile, save that, and hit play, you're going to see our player is dead. Okay? So that's all that this Boolean does. It's basically either a true or false statement, and then you can hook it up to a branch that checks this condition to see if it's either true or false, and then it executes whatever node is hooked up to either the true or false. There are many other different variable types, so if we select is player dead, if we hit the drop down on our variable type, you're going to see that there's many other different variable types. So if I add a new variable by clicking the plus button there, we can change this new variable to an integer. And an integer is just a number. So if I compile and save this, we can go ahead and in the details panel, we can name this my integer. Compile and save that. And then in the default value, you're going to see we have our default value set to 0. So all that integer is, all that this variable type is a whole number. So it can be 1, 24, 1000, even negative 100, basically any whole number. Now what this variable isn't is any decimal point. So if you do 0.5, you're going to see that it sets it to 0. Okay, you can't do 0.001, you can't do 0.1, you can't do any sort of decimal number, only a whole number. So an integer is what you'll use for things like, if you want to keep track of your player's level, or you want to keep track of how many items your player has. That's basically what you're going to use the integer for, any sort of number. We can add another new variable, and in the variable types, you can see we have some other different variables. The next big one that we have is a float, and we can go ahead and rename this to my float. Compile and save that. And basically our float is, instead of the integer, it is a decimal. So what it can be set to is 1.1. It could even be set to just 1, or it could be set to 0, 0.1, 0.05, and so on. Okay, so the float is used for decimal points, and typically you're going to use floats for things like your player's health, stamina, all those sort of different stats. We're going to add another new variable, and we're going to change this. You're going to see under the float we have things like name and string. I want to kind of gloss over name. We're going to sort of cover that later on in the course, but we're going to use this string. We can go ahead and rename the string to my string and compile and save this. So in our default value, we have my string, and if you select in here and start typing, you can see that we can type literally anything we want. So we can type test string 1 2 3 4 5 and whatnot. Okay, you can put decimals, numbers, whatever you want. Basically, a string is just a string of numbers, letters, characters, and you're going to notice that in this print string, it is also of the type, or of the variable type string. So if we select these two nodes and delete them, and delete this, what we can do is select our string variable and drag it into our graph and click the get. And what we can do is we can hook up the myString into the print string here, and hook up the event begin play to the print string. If we compile, save this, what we should see is when we hit the play button, we should see the print string be whatever we type as the default value for our string. Okay, so we hit play, we can see test string 1 2 3 4 5 and whatnot. So string is just a collection of random characters, letters, or whatever. So you could use this for, you know, things like text or descriptions, maybe a player's name. You could store that information inside of a string variable. We're going to add another variable here, and you see we have under the string we have text. Basically text is sort of the same thing as string, but you'll be using text a lot when you're programming the UI. We'll use this quite frequently later on in this course. Below that we have a vector. So if we select that, you can see that is this little yellow color. And if we name this to my vector and compile, save that, you're going to see in the default value we have these three entry points, or these three numbers. And whenever we hover over it, you're going to see we have the X, the Y, and the Z. So all that a vector is basically these three coordinates, the X, the Y, and the Z. So for example, if we select this cube in our scene, you're going to see our location is basically this vector, right? We have an X, a Y, and a Z. And basically the location here is just a vector, okay? So vector is just these three coordinates, the X, the Y, and the Z. Now if we click this drop down button, you're going to see we have a rotator and a transformation. So if we change this to rotator and change this to my rotator, compile and save that, you're going to see it's basically the same thing as vector, but in this case a rotator would be used for, you know, rotational values. Okay, but you can see it has an X, a Y, and a Z. So it'd be used sort of the same thing as the rotation of an object. Now the very last thing that we have here is a transformation. So if we select that and rename this to my transform, compile and save that, we can go ahead and expand this down here. And what we see here is a combination of a vector and rotator. So we have a vector for our location, then we have a rotator for our rotation, and then another vector for our scale. A transformation is the same thing that you see in your viewports whenever you select an object. You're going to see the default transformation. So if you wanted to create, you know, a transformation variable, you would use this sort of variable to maybe store the player's location, or maybe to store like a spawn point or something like that, if you ever needed to use this variable type. Of course, we will use this throughout the course. It will make a lot more sense as we move along the course. So we might get this little error message. That's okay, we can just go ahead and just delete this transform and compile, save that, and it will go away. Now the next thing that I want to cover is setting variables. So if you noticed, when we drag a variable onto our graph, we have either the get or the set option. And what I want to focus on now is the set. Okay, so the set basically allows us to set this variable. So you can see, is our player dead? We have this little checkbox just like we have in the default value here, where we can click to enable true, is our character dead, or click to enable false to set our character to is not dead. So what we can do is delete this string. We can hook up the set is player dead, and probably a better example would be to use the myString. So just delete this instead, and we'll drag in the myString and do a set myString. So basically we can set this string to whatever. So instead of using this default value, what we're going to do is when the game starts, we're going to set this to we just set the variable of my string. Okay, then we can hook this up to the print string. And what you're going to notice is off of the set here we have this little pin. So basically what this does is it prints that string, this string that we just set. So it should just print when the game starts this string that we just set. Okay, so we compile, save that, hit play. We'd say we just set the variable of my string. And if we were to delete this and drag in my string just like that, and compile, save this, and play, you're going to see that we get the default value of the string. Okay, down here. So you're going to see that you can basically either get the variable to retrieve its value, or you can set the variable to change its value. Now, the last thing that I want to cover in this overview of Blueprint is in the functions. So we're going to be using functions throughout the course, and a function is quite literally just a collection of nodes. So for example, this print string is actually a function, and the way that you can tell that is you're going to see this little F icon right in front of it, and you can even look at this jump right here, this jump node. You can see that we have this little F icon right there. So basically these jump nodes are functions. So all of these little blue nodes are basically functions, and all of these red nodes are either inputs or events. So each node has sort of a color code. But the main thing that you want to know about functions is that you can store logic inside of a function. So for example, if I wanted to add a new function, I could click this plus button, and what it just did there was, one, it added a new function right here, just like it does a variable. But two, you're going to see that it opened up a new window right here, or a new graph, named new function 0. Okay? And then here in the graph, you're going to notice that we have this little node, or this function node, that has an execution pin. So inside of this function, basically you can add any sort of Blueprint nodes or logic inside of this function, and then you can call this function inside of your graph. So for example, let's go ahead and rename this function. So you can either right click and rename it here, or double click to rename it, or you can select the function here and rename it up in the details panel. Alright, it's the same way. So I'm going to name this to my first function and compile, save that. Now in here in the function, we can go ahead and drag off of the pin and type in print string. And then inside of here for the string, we can just name this our first function. So if we compile and save that, we can go over to our event graph. And if you want, at any time, you can close your function by clicking the X there and reopening it by just double clicking it inside of the functions. But in the event graph, what we want to do is we want to now execute this function or call this function. Okay? So we can select the function right here and drag and drop it into our blueprint. So now we have our own very own function that we made. And if we double click to open it up, you're going to see, we can see what's inside of the function. So all that this does is it prints a string. So in our event graph, we can go ahead and select these two nodes and delete them. And we can hook up our function together using these little two execution pins. So now if we hit play, what we should see is when we hit play, our function should be called. And then inside of our function, what should happen is we should see this little print string on our screen. saying our first function. So inside of our first person map, if we hit play, we're going to see our first function on the screen. So basically a function is just a way that you can have all your nodes organized into a function that you can call whenever here on your event graph. So these are very useful for if you need to repeat certain logic. So for example, when we build our inventory system, we'll make quite a few functions that do various different checks. Check to see if this item is in our player's inventory, check to see if this item is a stackable item. Those will all be built into functions. So anyways, that's pretty much it for this very brief overview of the Blueprint editor, as well as explaining all of the Blueprint variables, functions, components, all those things like that. We can go ahead and actually delete all of the nodes that we've added here. So delete all of these, and we can delete all these variables because we won't be using any of these, and compile, save that. But in our next lecture, we're going to start getting into setting up our project by getting our own custom character set up. We're going to set up the third person as well as the walk animation, run animation. I want to show you how you can use first person character blueprint along with our custom character model to create our very own animated character. So with that being said, I'll see you guys there.